Hello, this talk for the Plural Positivity World Conference 2024 is called Autism, Dissociation and the Trauma of 1,000 Cuts. Before I begin, I'd like to go through some content notes. This talk will mention and allude to adverse experiences, including extreme events such as medical emergencies, bereavements, accidents, kidnapping, disasters, and war. Children's homes, institutionalization and foster care, childhood abuse and neglect, and other adverse childhood experiences, drugs and alcohol abuse, and also plural community gatekeeping and some highly charged discourse. This talk will go into more detail about the reality of being an autistic child, school and bullying, and the ways we may respond to upsetting events. During this, I will discuss the concept of trauma. This may remind you of bad experiences and you may relive old feelings. You should all have access to the replay video after the event. So if you feel that you're having an intense emotional reaction, you don't have to stay in the situation. You can leave the Air Meet event and finish the talk later. If you're watching the replay, then you can pause and take a break anytime you need. Please don't feel that you can't leave because I'm still talking. I would prefer to see people leaving the event than worry that anyone is stuck in upsetting memories. I'll warn you again when we get to the most potentially upsetting parts of the talk. My name is Nat. I am one of the hosts of the Casa Thymia Collective. I'm an autistic adult with diagnosed dissociative identity disorder, plus a lot of other things like ADHD, dyspraxia, hypermobile Ehlers-Danlos syndrome, and a number of other labels. I'm not a researcher or a psychologist or any kind of mental health or neurodevelopmental condition practitioner or specialist. Any expertise that I might have on this topic is simply by experience. I do have DID. I'm receiving complex trauma therapy through the UK NHS, the National Health Service. I do also, as a part-time job, train social workers and social care professionals about autism, but I am not claiming that that gives me expertise. For my appearance, I'm middle-aged, white with short brown hair, and I am wearing a dark-coloured, patterned knitted top that honestly just looks black on this camera. Here's my introduction. In this talk, I want to reframe how we think about autism, trauma, and dissociation. So to do that, I'm first going to give you their conventional descriptions, and then I'll be moving on to describe some different, more nuanced ways to consider trauma, dissociation, autistic experiences, and their interactions. This should then help us to explore why there seems to be a link between the autistic spectrum and dissociative disorders. In order to properly explore that link, we must first take a more nuanced view of how childhood dissociation develops. To do this, I'd like to put autism aside and go back to basics, describing what dissociation is and how dissociative disorders develop. Later, I'll be introducing autism into the mix, but for now, let's just make sure we're all on the same page when it comes to what we mean by dissociation and dissociative disorder. So part 1, developmental trauma and chronic stress. Until recently, the conventional view of trauma was that it required extreme events where you believed that you might die. Surprisingly recently, so that's things like war, kidnappings, hostage situations, disasters, extreme medical emergencies, and so on. Thankfully, with complex PTSD, the understanding has now expanded a lot to include long-term trauma, where the extreme stress lasts for a prolonged period over many days, months, or years. Ongoing childhood trauma is linked to the most severe mental disorders. The nuanced view, well, while the common understanding of long-term childhood trauma is that it's caused by intentional abuse, there are a number of other adverse childhood experiences, ACEs, that are considered to be potentially traumatic. These can all be described as sources of chronic stress and potentially insecure attachments. Social care professionals often prefer the term ACEs over trauma when talking about somebody's background. Okay, now content note, the slide that I'm about to go to is listing some particularly stressful and potentially traumatizing childhood experiences. It's only listing them, but I wanted you to be prepared. ACEs are highly stressful and potentially traumatic events or situations that occur during childhood and/or adolescence. They can be a single event or prolonged threats to and breaches of the young person's safety, security, trust, or bodily integrity. That's from Young Minds 2018. So these are things like physical, sexual, and emotional abuse and neglect, or exposure to domestic violence, living with somebody who abused drugs or alcohol, went to prison, or has a serious mental illness, losing a parent through divorce, death, or abandonment, or living in a children's home or in foster care. All of these are potentially associated with insecure attachments, so the adults in your life are either causing extreme stress or aren't able to support you through it. It's recognized that children who experience these things are at considerably greater risk of developing mental health problems. So let's talk a bit more about developmental trauma and the part that chronic stress has in that. If you were regularly experiencing extreme stress during childhood, you were likely exposed to high levels of stress hormones. These hormones are likely to have affected how your brain developed and contributed to the risk of other health problems. If your caregivers didn't adequately acknowledge the stress and support you through it, or were contributing to that stress, so you had no relief at home, your chronic stress is likely to have become particularly toxic to your developing brain. What do we mean when we're talking about stress in this context? Well, physiological stress is when your body's hormonal alarm system releases stress hormones meant for a fight or flight response, so running away or fighting back in response to an immediate threat. But this is happening in response to long-term threats and challenges when no physical reaction was actually required. Over the long term, this puts stress on your organs and inhibits or disrupts your body's systems. So during stress, adrenaline gets the heart racing and increases blood pressure, while cortisol increases blood sugars and their absorption to aid action and wound healing, while slowing non-essential functions like digestion, the immune system, growth, and the reproductive system. Prolonged or chronic stress has negative emotional, physical, cognitive, and behavioral effects, increasing many health risks. Research has also shown that prolonged stress can make the brain more receptive to stress hormones, working as a kind of feedback loop, making things like the anticipation of stress become more stressful themselves. And cortisol is not just a stress hormone. Cortisol doesn't just regulate short-term stress responses, it's also part of regulating the metabolism, controlling how the body uses sugars, proteins, and fats. It regulates blood sugar, increasing how much the liver produces during stress and counterbalancing the effects of insulin the rest of the time. It suppresses inflammation to boost your immunity during stressful injury. It regulates blood pressure, so high and low levels of cortisol can cause high and low blood pressure, and it helps to regulate your body clock because healthy cortisol levels are lowest in the evening and peak before you wake up in the morning. All of these functions are potentially disrupted by prolonged stress. So for example, if inflammation is constantly suppressed, then the immune system becomes less effective. So it's not really surprising at all that cortisol and chronic stress are linked to a range of health problems. And long-term effects of chronic stress, they don't happen to everyone, but strain on the organs from raised heart rate and blood sugar can result in increased risk in heart problems, high blood pressure, stroke, and type 2 diabetes. Chronic stress has been linked to earlier cognitive decline in older people. The immune system may be weakened, causing frequent colds and infections, or it may respond to stress like an illness, causing flu-like symptoms, headache, chronic pain, and so on. Not everyone experiences these health problems, though the factor most strongly tied to immune function appears to be extreme stress during childhood. And a study found that this included children who experienced chronic bullying. So that should probably also be considered a significant adverse childhood experience. And unfortunately, it's one of the ones that autistic children are much, much more likely to experience than their non-autistic peers. Okay, part 2, habitual dissociative responses and chronic unaddressed toxic stress. Let's look at how chronic stress can lead to the formation of dissociative disorders. I'm assuming that most of you in this audience know what dissociation is, but just to make sure we're on the same page, dissociation is when the conscious mind becomes distanced from the outside world or from the feelings and memories that it provokes. This can be part of a psychological defense mechanism where you're thinking things like, this isn't real, this isn't happening to me, those memories happened to somebody else, I don't remember, nothing happened. This is a common natural response to unbearable experiences or intense situations that we must get through in the moment. Everyone dissociates to some degree. Dissociation is on a continuum, and dissociation isn't always a problem. It can be positive or neutral. It can just be a reaction to boredom or a lack of mental stimulation. If you've ever driven, walked, or cycled somewhere and suddenly realized that you'd stopped paying attention and the last few minutes had happened on autopilot, well, that's a kind of dissociation. If you've ever zoned out or daydreamed during a class or a talk, then realized you had no idea what was being talked about, that was dissociation, even more so if you were the one talking. If you've ever got so into doing a task or reading a story that you lost all awareness of the outside world and forgot to eat, that's also a kind of dissociation. And humans really do need emotional detachment. If everyone became emotionally overwhelmed by all the injustice, suffering, war, hunger, poverty, greed, political corruption, so on in the world all the time, no one would be able to function. Sometimes we all need to be able to temporarily ignore or distance ourselves from overwhelming emotions or events. Rationalizing things away, compartmentalizing them so you're only worrying about them when you're at home, not when you're at work, even denying that something is happening, can all be helpful forms of dissociation. But if overwhelming or chronically understimulating experiences happen repeatedly over weeks or months, then dissociation can become a habit. Now, for simplicity, I'm mainly going to be talking about responses to stress from now on, but chronic understimulation can also be the reason that dissociation begins. And of course, understimulation can be very stressful itself. Don't forget that solitary confinement is considered to be a form of torture. So again, dissociation becomes a habit. So rather than responding to only the most extreme situations with detachment, daydreaming, distancing, denial, and so on, your brain slips into the dissociative response more and more easily. The defense mechanism starts to become the default reaction to stress. So instead of saying dissociative disorders, we could instead use the term habitual dissociative responses. These might be diagnosed as things like depersonalization, derealization disorder, maladaptive daydreaming disorder, dissociative amnesia, otherwise specified dissociative disorder, or DID, dissociative identity disorder. What are the causes? So short-term dissociative responses that look like limited episodes of a dissociative disorder are a normal way of coping with extreme stress. Things like medical emergencies, hostage situations, kidnapping, disasters, or war. And I am going to be doing some more discussion of trauma after this, but I won't be going into specifics. Initially responding to a bereavement with denial of reality is a common form of dissociation. When events with that level of intensity of emotion, stress, and threat are ongoing, these responses can become habitual and so develop into long-term dissociative disorders. The most significant dissociative disorders do usually begin in childhood in response to overwhelming, ongoing stress, i.e., adverse childhood experiences. Having this stress adequately recognized, acknowledged, and acted on by caregivers can significantly reduce the harm that it does. Overwhelming stress is most harmful when it is unrecognized and unaddressed by caregivers. This is when stress becomes particularly toxic. Dissociation is more likely during neglect, where the child is chronically understimulated, or when caregivers actively deny the reality of the stress or are the source of stress themselves. Now, this obviously describes a good number of the adverse childhood experiences we listed previously. For example, dissociative disorders are seen to be significantly more common amongst children who grew up in foster care. See Hillette et al. 2011 for more information about that. Rather than talking in terms of trauma or adverse childhood experiences, I prefer to frame the development of childhood dissociative disorders in terms of chronic, unaddressed, toxic stress, or CUTS. I want to stress this CUTS acronym is something I've come up with to summarize the concept into something we can refer to easily. This isn't a pre-existing term. So let's break it down. Chronic, the overwhelming stress occurs regularly over a long period, so the habitual response develops. Unaddressed, the stress isn't fully acknowledged and soothed by caregivers or is actively denied, so the child can't adapt or recover or may even have to actively hide the problem. And it's toxic. The brain and other organs are regularly flooded with stress hormones without adequate recovery time. Of course, not everyone responds to CUTS by habitually dissociating. A number of other mental health problems like OCD could develop instead of or alongside dissociation. Rather than dissociating, the damage may show through behavioral problems or self-medicating with drugs or alcohol as well. And just to throw in a wild card into the mix of our causes of dissociation, some studies have also shown that the parents of dissociative disorder patients are significantly more likely to have dissociative experiences themselves. Is this simply indicative of the cycles of generational trauma, or do we in some way learn to freeze, fawn, float, fade, fantasize, and forget, rather than fight or flight our way through stress by the example of our caregivers? Perhaps it's easier to learn dissociative coping strategies if these are already being modeled to us. Okay, it's time to bring autism back into the mix and look at autism and chronic unaddressed toxic stress. So why am I even doing this talk? Well, one of the earliest ways that I learned to recognize that other people were fellow undiagnosed autistics was a pattern where they would respond to difficult, noisy social situations like a meetup in a bar or something like that by staying put and starting to become more and more spacey and incoherent, to the point where they would not be able to leave the situation. They maybe couldn't even talk properly. So then I'd have to rescue them by helping them to get out of that situation and home to safety. And I recognize this because others had had to do this to me in the past. I would be uncomfortable, and instead of just standing up and leaving, I would get more and more disorientated. My speech would slur. I would be looking at my hands. And I later learned that this was a maladaptive dissociative response, a broken coping mechanism of freezing or flopping in place. So when I realized that a lot of the things that I've been linking to autism were dissociative in nature, I started to wonder, are autistic people more dissociative? And then when I joined online support spaces for dissociative disorders, like the Plural Association, well, I quickly noticed that there were lots of autistic traits on display and a lot of diagnosed autism here too. As I heard more community descriptions of the realities of living with things like depersonalization, derealization, dissociative amnesia, and OSDD, I also recognized that a lot of these ideas mapped onto concepts that my autistic communities often discussed, or at least heavily overlapped with them. So I began to think about why autism might make habitual dissociation more likely. Let's start by looking at what autism is and some sources of additional stress faced by autistic people. So autism is a different way of perceiving, thinking about, and interacting with the world due to brain differences. Autistic experiences are extremely varied because it's a spectrum of an almost infinite range of different colours that are all different ways autism presents. But autism always comes with differences in communication and socializing that are often disabling, particularly in a non-autistic world. Increased stress around uncertainty and change, different sensory experience and sensory needs to what's typical, and this all adds up to a higher level of chronic stress and less ability to manage that stress. So to summarize that, being autistic is stressful. On top of all those typical sources of stress that everyone faces in their daily lives, autistic difficulties with change and transitions particularly can quickly add up to become extremely stressful. Research has found that decision-making tends to be more stressful for autistic people too. Unexpected changes, unfamiliar situations, small problems and decisions throughout the day all contribute to cumulative stress. Sensory issues and hostile sensory environments add to the stress load. And we know from research that the more stressed an autistic person is, the less able they are to cope with adverse sensory situations. They kind of all interact with each other. Social isolation or bullying are more likely, which can impact stress relief. A lot of things that non-autistic people do to relieve their stress is interact with other people. And common masking strategies to hide autism are extremely stressful to perform and strongly linked to mental health problems. So being an autistic adult makes you prone to chronic stress. But do autistic children really experience the levels of chronic, unaddressed toxic stress that are seen during the commonly recognized adverse childhood experiences? Well, let's have a look at some research. So, first of all, the top paper here, the 2022 paper, is a literature review. So that's looked at a big set of different studies and has confirmed that autistic children do respond significantly more strongly to stress. So the study I particularly want to draw your attention to is the one where this graph comes from. So this is a 2012 study where some autistic children and some non-autistic controls were exposed to stress. First, their cortisol, their stress hormone levels in their saliva was measured. Then they were also given a blood test, a stressful blood test. Then an hour later, their stress hormone levels were measured again. Once the stress had been removed, they were no longer in the stressful situation. So let's have a look at this graph. So as we start off, some of the autistic children have as much as twice as much cortisol already before we even start. Then they are all exposed to stress. Everybody's stress level increases, but the non-autistic controls only increase a little bit, whereas the autistic children are having something like, 3 to 4 times as much of a response. But what's most notable is that not only did the autistic children respond more strongly to stress, but an hour later, when the stressful event had ended, no stress was present, the autistic children we're still seeing 3 times as much of a response to stress as the controls did when the stressful event was happening. So what this is showing is that they're responding with higher levels of the stress hormone cortisol that we've already talked about. Autistic children respond more strongly to stress, and then that stress result stays strong for a long time after the source of stress has been removed. And of course, it's very likely something else stressful is going to happen after this, so their baseline of cortisol is already high, and then they'll get higher and higher. So it's not hard to see how things become very stressful very quickly. So let's look at some childhood autistic stressors. Studies have found significantly raised cortisol stress hormone levels for autistic children observed after environmental changes or novel situations that might not be stressful to others. So that's unfamiliar situations and surroundings, a thing that we know that autistic people struggle with. Higher evening cortisol was associated with stressful changes in routine or day-to-day schedule. So that is, again, something that we know autistic children, autistic adults struggle with, changes to your routine. Voluntary engagement in social play, so that's just playing with other children, even when there wasn't any forced interaction, evaluative threat, or peer rejection, only benign conditions, also saw significant increase in stress hormone levels. So before we established that chronic bullying in childhood was associated with a weaker immune system and an immune response to stress in adulthood. But this shows that even playing with friendly children can be a significant source of stress for autistic children. So even though it's an enjoyable experience, it's still causing a chronic stress response. Research has also found that increased stress hormone response is associated with greater sensory sensitivity. Even without sensory sensitivities at play, autistic people are less able to modulate sensory activation. So all the small background noises and sensations, the scratchiness of your clothing and all of that add up to a cumulative sensory load. The sound of the computer fan, the flicker of the lights, the tickles of your clothing on your skin. Some researchers have made links between autistic sensory overactivation and trauma responses. See Sensory Trauma, Autism Sensory Difference and the Daily Experience of Fear by Fulton et al., 2020. Sensory adverse environments can be sources of chronic stress. Sensory sensitivities and the risk of sensory overload tend to worsen when autistic people are under stress, which then add to further stress. And this all adds up to chronic stress. Children with autism have greater between subject and within subject variability in daily cortisol responses than neurotypical children, and in addition have a higher level of dysregularity. So this pair of graphs shows that autistic children have a much more disordered and irregular daily pattern of highs and lows of stress hormone response, and they may vary from day to day for the same child, and the patterns of variance between different autistic children are much more different than between non-autistic children. This is indicative of a very dysregulated stress result as a result of chronic stress. Reduced cortisol values in concert with higher stress measures may be a result of chronic stress, particularly with social stress. This all adds up to a much lower barrier of entry for autistic children. With more sources of stress, a significantly higher stress result, and stress hormones remaining at high levels long after the stressful situation, autistic children are much more likely to experience chronic toxic stress. The baseline for what becomes an adverse childhood experience, resulting in unbearable stress and potential trauma responses, is likely to be much lower. Just attending school is likely to be extremely stressful, even if only the sensory environment is considered, not even the social aspects. So we've established a much higher likelihood of chronic toxic stress. Now, is the extent of that toxic stress fully addressed? Is it recognized, understood, soothed, managed, and reduced by caregivers? Do they teach adequate coping strategies? I would say that undiagnosed autistic children are particularly unlikely to have their chronic stress fully addressed. Not having your autism recognized in childhood should probably be considered an adverse childhood experience all on its own. The acronym happening to be cut feels particularly appropriate, as the chronic toxic stress associated with autism, particularly undiagnosed autism, tends to be a cumulative load of stressful things that seem insignificant if you're judged by neurotypical standards. But taken together, it is a case of the death by 1,000 cuts. There is a strong tendency for the parents of undiagnosed autistic children to initially attempt to downplay or ignore their children's struggles, which may leave stress unrecognized, unaddressed, and unsupported. Behavioral approaches to autism focused on suppressing autistic behaviors and encouraging positive behavior are also likely to contribute to cuts. More on that later. Being an autistic child is just very stressful. Not having your autism recognized and adequately supported in childhood is very likely to result in chronic unaddressed toxic stress. Even if fully recognized and supported, autistic kids still have to engage with all the social and sensory stresses and uncertainty of the outside world. Just attending school alone can be hours of stress that takes hours more to recover from. And even voluntary social play without threat or rejection has been shown to result in raised stress hormone levels. Conversely, actual lessons may be chronically understimulating for some children, resulting in habitual daydreaming and derealization. So autistic kids will need to learn to develop their own coping strategies, and their caregivers should accept and support this. Let's have a look at autism and habitual dissociation. I'm pausing here to recognize that some of what I'm about to do in this talk is an unnuanced oversimplification bordering on a thought exercise and taking my ideas too far. I'll be veering into making yet another grand unified autistic theory of everything, where the part of autism that I happen to be studying explains all other autistic traits. A little bit like things like the intense world theory. But it's always more complicated than that. In reality, there will always be lots of other interacting factors all at play together. With that aside, let's explore what autistic dissociation looks like. And I do want to give a content note here. We are now going to be talking about the realities of being an autistic child. So if you do feel that you want to take a break before this and come back and watch the pre-record, that would be a great idea. If you need to ground, I would encourage you to go and do it. Okay, let's start with social withdrawal. The intense world theory suggests that autistics perceive their surroundings as not only overwhelmingly intense due to hyperreactivity of primary sensory areas, but also as adverse and highly stressful due to an overly reactive amygdala, which also makes quick and powerful fear associations with usually neutral stimuli, fear of colour, for example. A natural coping strategy to deal with this kind of emotional overflow could be social avoidance and withdrawal. That's from the intense world theory of autism that showed that there are very strong fear reactions in autistic children to things that most people would not consider to be scary or threatening. And it's suggesting that social withdrawal, so the things we associate with the most profound autism, may be dissociative in nature. Let's talk about behaviorism again. So, the only reliable way to recognize autism is by observing behavior. There isn't yet a really good blood test or brain scan that can reliably tell us somebody is autistic. So during diagnosis, we have to look at behavior. Things like sensory distress are treated as restrictive, repetitive patterns of behavior and not as the person having an intense, distressing, stressful experience. This has led to some therapies like applied behavioral analysis and positive behavioral supports that focus on training autistic people to suppress their autism and pretend to be normal. But if autism is treated as a series of behaviors that need to be reduced, rather than reactions to overwhelming emotional, sensory, and stress responses, we are training people to ignore their distress. If you're taught to respond to stress by burying your feelings and suppressing your reactions, you are effectively being trained to dissociate. Taking away the ability to recognize, self-soothe, minimize, and escape stressful situations leaves few healthy coping mechanisms when adverse childhood experiences do occur. And so dissociative disorders become more likely. And I'd say this also applies to the undiagnosed or late diagnosed autistic children as well, because undiagnosed autistic people kind of go through their own type of informal training. Why did my young undiagnosed autistic friends react to being overwhelmed by loud social situations by staying put and becoming more and more spaced out and incoherent? Well, it felt like being at school, where you're taught by teachers and peers alike to stay in your seat, keep quiet, hide your difference, and not show any distress. We learn to ignore being overwhelmed by sensory onslaughts because everybody tells us it's not loud, it's not bright, and we're making a fuss over nothing. Dissociation becomes the only option. So let's talk about masking strategies. The common autistic coping strategy of masking involves putting a filter or mask between yourself and the world, which already sounds a little dissociative. Social skills are performed as a series of scripts or rules that you've learnt. You're effectively constantly role-playing, pretending to be normal, objectively analysing the correct response in every situation rather than acting naturally. This often involves a level of detachment where emotions are suppressed, ignored, or observed externally rather than acted on. You might develop a series of elaborate rules and slavishly follow those rather than your own desires. This is sometimes described as making customer service voice your entire personality. This is intensely stressful, linked to mental health problems, and can deepen social isolation as no one fully sees the real you, only the mask that you're presenting. I could go on and on in this section, but let's do a quick rundown of some other autistic dissociative experiences, or things that could be partially described or explained in terms of dissociation. So skills lost and burnout overlaps with dissociative amnesia. Forgetting how to do tasks is one of the things that's recognized as dissociative amnesia. Hyperfocus and flow states are usually placed on a dissociative spectrum, and it isn't hard to see how that autistic trait, also an ADHD trait, of being distracted by everything or not being able to concentrate, and then going to the other extreme of not taking in anything from the outside world. Again, that's pretty dissociative. Inertia and getting stuck, so difficulty starting and stopping things, could be due to maladaptive dissociation, perhaps developing from habitual daydreaming or zoning out. Alexithymia and sensory undersensitivity could be repression. So you are not allowing yourself to feel your senses, or you are putting your senses or your emotions to one side. Detached assessment of your emotional state, or forgetting the emotional content of memories, could be forms of dissociative switching, depersonalization, or amnesia. I first recognized this from people talking about how OSDD was different to DID for them. I switched and I no longer feel my emotions related to what was happening reminded me a lot of things talked about in the autistic community. Let's look at some free-range autistic coping strategies. What sorts of coping strategies do autistic kids use if they are recognized as autistic? They are supported fully and allowed to be weird. Now, I'm lucky enough to know some families where both parents are autistic self-advocates, so I can somewhat answer this. Often, free-range coping strategies involve playing games of pretend or call and response that give the autistic child some control of the situation or add a layer of distance from unfiltered reality. This is things like speaking in a funny voice and always asking the same questions, requiring the same responses, so getting everyone else to play along with a game or a ritual. Also things like insisting you're really an alien or a train or a robot or a cat or your favourite TV character, and want everyone else to play along for months at a time. Coping strategies might also involve creative imagination. For example, picturing everyone around you as a different type of animal, or fantasizing that your teachers and classmates are secretly robots or spies. It might involve imaginary friends, or projecting personalities or feelings onto everyday objects around you, or onto your favorite toys. Perhaps even talking or expressing your needs through them. Coping with stress by playing pretend, daydreaming, or imagining that you're part of a story isn't necessarily problematic and doesn't need to be discouraged. They are hugely helpful tools to make the world more manageable and should not be stigmatized. But these are small steps from becoming the starts of maladaptive dissociative responses once the child is exposed to adverse childhood experiences. So again, there is a lower bar to developing a dissociative response like maladaptive daydreaming disorder or depersonalization derealization, because these are already the types of coping strategies being employed. And again, I'd like to remind you that the parents of dissociative disorder patients are significantly more likely to have dissociative responses themselves. Well, autism is genetic. Families with two autistic parents are a lot more likely to have autistic children. A very common way to realize that you're an undiagnosed autistic adult is when one of your children or relatives' children is diagnosed as autistic, and everyone says, "Oh, they're just like you at that age." Even when parents of an autistic child are not autistic themselves, they are significantly more likely to have autistic traits, and there is a huge amount of research about this. So if you agree with me that there is a link between autism and dissociation, it is more likely that the parents of autistic children are modeling some dissociative coping strategies that could be learnt and used when that child is experiencing chronic stress. Okay, now let's have a look at dissociative identity and autism. Let's move on to plurality and whether the interaction of autism and CUTS has a role there. So the conventional view of dissociative disorders is that they occur on a scale of intensity with identity alteration and DID, plurality, at the most extreme, acute, or complex end of the scale. These more complex dissociative disorders are considered to be caused by childhood trauma. It's often said that the more severe the dissociation, the more significant the trauma that was experienced. This requirement for severe childhood trauma causes conflict gatekeeping and discourse within the plural community, as not all systems recognize this link, even some with DID like my system. So let's have a look at how dissociative identity formation happens. The theory of structural dissociation, which I have a number of reservations about, posits that all children begin with different parts of their personality and don't develop a fully integrated self-image until later in childhood. I've seen this quoted as something like typically happening about 9 years old. Now, one of the common features of autism is that developmental milestones, such as developing speech, repeating words, echolalia, theory of mind, learning idioms, and so on, can happen at different times to what's typical. This can be considerably later or never at all. So I'll just leave that there for you to consider. Identity confusion and alteration and dissociative identity disorder are considered to be the most severe forms of dissociation that must therefore require the most extreme childhood trauma and adverse childhood experiences in order to interrupt the formation of the self. But I would argue that once again, autism lowers the bar of entry here. So the internal family systems theory suggests that everyone has parts to their personalities with different roles that act as a kind of inner family with inner children and inner parents along with exiled, unacceptable selves. They would say that when you say a part of me thinks that, it is literally true. And they perform this therapy on people who are not considered to be plural. Anecdotally, I've noticed that autistic people may react differently to non-autistic people when exposed to the IFS style of parts-based therapy or similar things like inner child work. Over time, some of us can begin to unpick our singular sense of selves if encouraged to think of our identity as a collection of parts with different needs. So autistic singular self-identity might be more fragile than it is for non-autistic people. So why is that? Well, there's some research on this that shows that autistic people may have a neurological impairment in self-referential cognitive processing. What does that mean? Well, here is a brain scan which shows that there are two different areas of the brain. This is a gross simplification. Two different areas of the brain. One which gives you self-information. So if you're asked what's your favorite color, one part of your brain just tells you what it is. And there is another part of the brain for what's the King of England's favorite color? Or does Taylor Swift like ice cream? So what it turns out is that when asked to consider in 2009 the British Queen's opinions versus one's own opinions, non-autistic controls had significantly different levels of brain activation, while autistic people did not. So for neurotypical people, a question like, does the king think that it's important to keep a diary, would result in a lot more thinking and speculating about possibilities based on past knowledge of the king, while do you think that it's important to keep a diary would have a more immediate and definite response from self-knowledge. Autistic people in this study did just as much thinking and speculating about their own opinions and preferences as they would another person. Autism may be a lack of innate self-identity. We know ourselves by observation, is what this research found. So autistic people already tend to have a more detached and depersonalized view of our own identities. We are more likely to know ourselves by considering past observed behavior the same way we would a family member or a celebrity like Beyonce. While autistic people are more likely to be consciously aware of our masks, personas, and scripting, everybody has different personas in different situations. Neurotypical people also feel and behave differently with their parents compared to their friends, with their boss, or their teachers. Code switching is a real and very well documented thing. Perhaps autistic people are more able to see the realities of human identity. We are all different parts, masks, and personas. Let's look at mimicry and mental rehearsal. And before I do this, the slide after this one will be discussing unacceptable selves and will mention meltdowns and abuse. So just be aware of that. So we already talked about masking strategies. So that usually starts by mimicking other people around us. We work out what are the acceptable ways to behave by looking at other people. Often we may do this by fixating on a particular friend or classmate and learn to model how they would behave and what they would do in any situation. We may also rehearse conversations with other people by developing a mental model of what they're likely to say and how they're likely to react. Some autistic people actually report significant distress when people around them deviate from their mental model of how they were expected to behave. It might feel that something's terribly wrong with the person that you're talking to or with everything you've based your life on. So with this strong mimicry, strong awareness of another person, already being aware of talking with this other person all the time or with acting as this other person all the time, some autistic people may slip into feeling that this person is taking over from them or literally telling them what to do during adverse experiences, because they're already very well rehearsed in producing what that person thinks and what they would say. So it's already a dissociative response and it's comfortable and easy to slip into doing that. Okay, let's talk about repression of unacceptable selves. Again, a content note for these two slides. Autistic children tend to have a more intense experience of the world and more intense emotional expression in reaction to this. We may learn to entirely suppress awareness of our negative emotions as a coping strategy or, as we've talked about before, due to external training. This can cause our negative emotions to only be expressed when they have reached extreme levels that can no longer be suppressed. So, autistic meltdowns may also be the result of a type of dissociation. Children may conceive of these negative feelings as another unacceptable, exiled self, particularly if these thoughts are associated with a rehearsed or mimicked external person, such as an abusive authority figure or school bully, or are experienced during depersonalization. And unfortunately, autistic children may also learn to repress positive emotions too, or to associate these emotions with upsetting situations where they were shamed or felt unsafe, bullied, or punished. Unfiltered autistic joy is often intense and shown with hand flapping, jumping up and down, and things like squealing. This can be very misunderstood and discouraged or treated as immature by both adults and other children around them. Autistic interests may be perceived as age, gender, or socially inappropriate, annoying, or harmful by others. So repressed selves may be perceived by the autistic child as younger than they are and or of another gender. Autistic depression may have a dissociative basis. You may have learned that it's not safe to feel happy or to show happiness. Unmasking and supporting exiled selves may help to heal this. So let's wrap things up. You may or may not agree with my interpretation, but it seems to me that we can conclude that autistic people have a lower bar to entry for developing habitual dissociative responses to ongoing adverse experiences. I prefer to frame the reasons for this as cuts rather than trauma. I don't think it's very empowering to have to think of just existing as autistic as being traumatizing in the same way as the most upsetting adverse childhood experiences. Considering chronic unaddressed toxic stress and its associations with adverse childhood experiences as leading to habitual dissociative responses allows for more nuance. Parents of autistic children are more likely to have both autistic traits and dissociative traits, so it is possible that dissociation can be learned by example. And my final thoughts, it is important to be aware of the wider range of adverse experiences that can lead to the development of habitual dissociative responses or dissociative disorders. Awareness of the level of chronic unaddressed toxic stress experienced by autistic children and the types of coping strategies that they employ may challenge the conventional expectation that only the most severe and intentional abuse leads to dissociative identity disruption. Thank you for your time, and I'm looking forward to your questions and comments. Thanks, everybody.